In a Reader's Digest anecdote, a man wrote of a conversation he had on a trip which kind of put him in his place. He writes, "My seatmate on this flight was a woman. Ever the charmer, I asked, does the airline charge you extra for sitting next to good-looking men? Yes, she said, but I wasn't willing to pay the extra cost." Today's gospel begins with Jesus and a Samaritan woman doing something extraordinary. They're having a real, honest conversation, one of far greater depth than the story I just shared. Now, you might not think that a conversation is that extraordinary, be it then or now, but I think they are more uncommon than we realize. Let me explain. Occasionally we say things like, "Oh, we had a great conversation." But what that really means is that one person spent 30 minutes talking at another person. Or we'll send a note or write an email or assume that the other person that we're sending it to will read it and either learn something or change their life in response to it. But we don't really believe that we might be the ones that need to learn something or that need to change. More often than not, what we call conversation is really one or both people talking at each other instead of them talking to each other. You see, a conversation can only take place between people if there are three elements in place. First, the people must recognize at the outset that they have different backgrounds, different traditions, different families, different values. They may even come from different parts of the world. In other words, we have to recognize that the other person is more than the sum of our stereotypes about them. The second thing we need to remember is that the two people must have enough in common with each other that they can actually talk with one another. And finally, the people must be open to the possibility that either one or both of them will be changed by this exchange. When all three of those elements are in place, that is a conversation. And a real conversation is a difficult thing to do. We can easily get ahead of the other person. We can interrupt them. We do all kinds of things that are contrary to conversation. At its best, conversation is difficult because we have chasms to cross. Chasms of gender or race or culture or ethnic background or economic status, even religious background. And what makes it tough to have a conversation is that many people become defensive as a conversation starts to happen. I don't mean that in a negative way. Many people simply want to protect themselves. And the way you protect yourself when the conversation starts to get a little too deep for you is to change the subject. And there are all kinds of ways to change the subject. For example, when it comes to religion, you can change the subject simply by getting a denominational squabble going. It's what Jesus and the woman in today's gospel end up doing when she asks, "Our ancestors worshipped at this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem. Now, which is right, Jesus?" One difficulty of defensiveness is that it's hard to continue the conversation and to move past it in a gracious way. Take the issues around gender in today's gospel. This Samaritan woman was probably wondering why a Jew was talking to her, wondering what he was really after. I want to pause here and say that this woman has often been given a bad reputation. 5 husbands and now a man who is not her husband. It sounds pretty bad. But she very easily could have been widowed or abandoned or divorced. 5 times would be heartbreaking, but not impossible. On top of that, she could now be living with someone that she was dependent upon, or be in what's called a levirate marriage, where a childless woman is given to her deceased husband's brother so that an heir can be produced to continue his line. So we can't just say that she's a stereotypical unclean sinner. In fact, there are a number of ways in which we can imagine this woman's story is tragic instead of scandalous. But one thing is clear from the gospel. She's been passed around in this community and become someone who others are accustomed to looking down to. And yet, Jesus sees her. He recognizes her, he speaks with her, and he offers her something of incomparable worth. She exists for him. And his conversation with her dispels any fear that she has of not being accepted. And that is the power of conversation. Through it, she discovers her worth in God's eyes. This nameless woman has pretty much everything stacked against her. She's a Samaritan woman in a Jewish story, a woman in a male-dominated world. She's lived a challenging and probably tragic life and is very likely dependent on others. And yet, after her encounter with Jesus, she leaves behind her water jar, maybe symbolic of all of the chores and the distractions and difficulties that she has in life. She leaves that behind and goes and tells everyone in her community what God has done for her. Now compare her for a moment to the story of the man that we heard in last week's gospel, the story of Nicodemus. He's well-educated, religiously observant, probably a lot better off than she is. He's a culturally righteous insider who doesn't get it when he talks with Jesus. The one who should have understood who Jesus was and why he was there does not. And the one who Jesus shouldn't have even spoken with ends up helping to convert her entire town. It makes me wonder, what conversations have you failed to have that have become missed opportunities for seeing a God at work in your life and the lives of those around you? What conversations have you missed out on? But don't just stop there. Maybe this week ask yourself, what conversation can I have with someone around me that might open up the door to see how God is working in my life and the lives of those around me? Just try and have one of those conversations this week. You know, when the woman starts asking Jesus about what separates Jews from Samaritans, he tells her, that's not the point. He says the point is worshiping God in spirit and in truth, and the time has come for all to worship God, not according to a place, but according to God's own nature. In other words, it's not about me accepting you or you accepting me. It's about God who accepts all of us. There's always a temptation for us, for each of us, to talk at God. But you know, Jesus always finds a way to get a word in edgewise. When the world thought it had silenced him forever on the cross, he found a way to keep the conversation going with his resurrection. When we get defensive all he has to do is show us his hands, the marks of the nails for us. When we try and change the subject away from God's love for the world, he forgives us and washes us with life-giving water in baptism. And when we feel unworthy to share what he has done, when we feel ill-equipped, the Spirit transforms us like it did that woman at the well, so that when we find ourselves in honest conversations of our own, we can do what she did. We can invite others to see everything that Christ has done for us. Amen.